Hello, this is Blaine Bridges with Pop Theology. I once heard an atheist tell a gut-wrenching story about the death of a friend. He was a Christian radio show host, and upon learning about his friend's death, he was suddenly overcome with this unshakable question. How could God allow my friend, this wonderful Christian devoted to Jesus Christ, to be taken from the earth so soon and in such a horrifying way? This question became all-consuming. It ate away at his faith, and doubt slowly crept in. And he found, after a long enough period of time, without a resolution or an answer to this question and concern, that he could no longer assent to the claim that God exists. Now, I do not understand the mysteries of God and cannot provide a substantial answer to his question about why God would take his friend from the earth in such a terrible and untimely way. But I can address in a meaningful way the nature of doubt and ask whether or not doubt is a sturdy enough foundation upon which to inquire about the most fundamental questions posed to mankind that we have asked ourselves, that we have inquired about throughout human history. Now, what is doubt? Now, I want to propose a somewhat novel definition of doubt, and it is an anxiety about assent, a concern or a reservation about saying yes to a particular proposition. And that reservation is predicated on a kind of ignorance, and that ignorance compels anxiety within us. How could this be true? Why would such a thing be true? And the unanswerable nature of the question leads us away from an assent to a proposition of any kind. Now, how do we begin our meditation on the nature of doubt and its utility? Well, why not begin with the saint of doubt, Descartes. Descartes, in his book Meditation on First Philosophy, begins a program of doubt, right, in an attempt to reconstruct a metaphysical framework from which the nature of reality can be ascertained. At that time, the Aristotelian metaphysics that had predominated the philosophical community had sort of calcified and ossified and were beginning to crumble based on some recent scientific discoveries. And Descartes said, this is a terrible situation for us to be in. We need a tool or a means to investigate the world around us. And Descartes said, I know what to do. If I cannot rely upon my senses, as Aristotelian philosophy is predicated on reasoning about the world from our senses, and the abilities of our senses were being doubted, I am going to begin a project of doubt where I disregard my senses entirely. I'm going to question absolutely everything that can be questioned. And he looks around his room and he sees a fireplace and a mantel and a chair. And he says to himself, what if I am deluded about the existence of this fireplace? What if I'm deluded about the existence of this mantel? What if I'm deluded about the existence of this chair? Indeed, he goes through every phenomenon that his senses apprehend. And he says to himself, what if I am wrong about the existence of these things? What if indeed I am wrong about the very existence of God himself, upon whom all of these things are made possible? Now, this is an incredibly dramatic thought experiment. And Descartes ultimately comes to a conclusion. As he's looking around, he realizes what I can say definitively is that even though I cannot know with any certainty that the physical world around me exists, what I can know is that I am a thinking thing, and that there is nothing that can persuade me that I am not thinking. And it is from this subjective standpoint, right? The inward I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which formulates the famous foundation of his entire philosophy, that he attempts to reconstruct our entire understanding of the world itself. Now, many questions arise from this thought experiment, some of which I'll get into in more detail. But one of the most interesting questions that Descartes raises is about the nature of his cognition. And he says, now, I can doubt the existence of the external world. Indeed, I can doubt the very existence of my body. What if I am just a brain in a vat, and there is some kind of evil God, right, who has created this world of deception and illusion? Okay, now I had said that Descartes began his program of doubt based on the growing skepticism in his society about the utility of our senses to discover the natural world. And so his thought experiment ultimately culminates prior to his assertion that he could not doubt that he was a thinking thing, that indeed he could be a brain in a vat, and that the entire world is an illusion created by a malevolent God who is deceiving him. Now, it is this part of his thought experiment in which he doubted absolutely everything that can be doubted that I want to draw special attention to. We need to fixate on this point. Because, as I said, Descartes' entire reconstruction of the philosophical tradition began from this perception that he could not doubt that he was a thinking thing. And from this foundation, he reestablishes that certain ideas that he holds, right, about the nature of perfection, about goodness and truth and beauty, could not arise simply and solely from his own imagination, but had to be placed there by a benevolent God, right? Because the concept of perfection is not found anywhere in the world because the world itself is imperfect. And since we cannot, by reason, establish the reality of perfection from imperfect states, the concept of perfection itself must have been placed in my mind by a good God, because only a good God could conceive of perfection. And my aspiration for perfection must have been implanted within me by this benevolent God. Okay, now let us go back all the way to the point where Descartes suggests that he is a brain in a vat and a malevolent God is deceiving him. Well, there are some problems with this thought experiment at this point. Okay, so Descartes is rejecting our senses. We need to reestablish our relationship to ontology through our subjective point of view, by reason alone, not without the aid of the senses. Oh, but do you see an issue here? Imagine for a moment that Descartes really is a brain in a vat, and some malevolent God is creating this world through some kind of illusion. This implies something about Descartes' experience as a brain in a vat. It implies one of two possibilities. The first is that his brain is being stimulated by this malevolent deity. Now, stimulation is an interesting word, but it's the right word to describe the way in which this malevolent God is enacting his deception. If Descartes' brain is being stimulated, Descartes is acknowledging the primacy of some kind of primitive sense. But Descartes wanted to reject the senses because the metaphysical system that had endured up to the point that it began to be doubted was predicated on reasoning about the world through our senses. And he wanted to reject senses entirely, right? and reestablish things through subjective reason alone. But here, at the climax of his thought experiment, we find that he unconsciously permits a certain kind of sense, one that can stimulate the brain. And so, from this point of view, if indeed he is a brain vat, whose entire perception of the world is an illusion stimulated in his mind by a malevolent God, then senses are integral and a necessary part of his experience in life, and indeed a foundation from which he understands certain aspects of reality. And so, from this point, we establish that we cannot ignore our senses or doubt them in some way. This poses a major problem for Descartes, but let us be generous to Descartes and say that Descartes is suggesting that no, I am not saying that my apprehension comes from stimulation from an external source. All right. And instead, it is the brain itself that was designed to think this way independently. All right. Well, that poses yet another challenge. Indeed, if the brain itself was designed to generate the illusory world of this malevolent God, then the brain is by nature an organ of deception and absolutely nothing that it thinks can be trusted. All right, so from Descartes' own thought experiment, we have the obliteration of all knowledge and every conclusion that the mind can draw, including those about the nature of perfection and goodness, and ultimately his attempt to reestablish the existence of a benevolent God who implanted ideas of goodness and beauty and justice and perfection within us. And his entire project fails. And so we find this rather devastating realization contained within Descartes' thought experiment. And that is that the metaphysical claims of Orthodox Christianity are a bulwark against the thought that stops thought. If our senses cannot be trusted, if our minds are organs of deception, if our brains are in vats and they are being stimulated by a malevolent God, we cannot trust anything. We cannot say anything true about anything under any circumstance or for any reason ever. And the entire project of knowledge disintegrates before our eyes. And what does that say about us? What is the purpose in reasoning about the world? There is no purpose to reason in any shape, form, or way. There is no purpose in trying to communicate the truth or in trying to establish a philosophy. All of it blows away like ash. This is a terrible state to be in. We become nothing but benighted and confused apes who are utterly hopeless and baffled by the world around us. Nothing can ever be said that means anything under any circumstance for any reason. Now, this, I think, highlights and explains completely why it is that doubt is not a sufficient foundation upon which to investigate truth claims or to discover the reality of anything. Because ultimately, a program predicated on doubt will lead us to a conclusion that we cannot say that anything is true ever. Not about ourselves, not about the nature of the world around us. We cannot trust any thought that we have. You see, Descartes forgot two essential things about philosophy. First and foremost, that philosophy is predicated on wonder. And that is that we look out on the majesty of the world and are overcome by its inexplicability. And that inexplicability of the world provokes a sense of awe that leads us to begin to investigate the nature of reality and discover the truth that underlies it. If you are going to ask essential questions about the nature of the world, that is, does the physical world exist? Is truth a reality? Is goodness a reality? Is beauty a reality? Does God himself exist? We must begin with wonder. Wonder is the predicate of the philosophical life. It is that thing that generates the philosophical life. And the teleological aim of philosophy is conversion to the truth. All right. The second thing that Descartes forgot was the wisdom of Socrates, who in the Apology outlines why it is the oracle told him he is the wisest man in all of Greece. And that is the realization that Socrates knew nothing. And that knowledge separated him from all the people who believed they knew something. And so if we're going to doubt, we must not do it as Descartes did. We must not use doubt as the foundation of our investigation into reality. Doubt's only place in the intellectual life is to doubt ourselves. Thank you very much. Like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. Have a wonderful day.